Did you know Brooklyn is known as the Borough of Churches? During the 19th century, Brooklyn's population exploded. As new residents poured into the city, churches seemed to appear on nearly every corner. I like to joke that in Brooklyn, it sometimes feels like there's one church for every 10 people. That growth also created fierce competition for congregants, which helps explain why you'll occasionally come across names like St. Anne and the Holy Trinity or Plymouth Church of the Pilgrims. As neighborhoods changed and population shifted, many congregations merged, leaving behind church names that tell the story of Brooklyn's evolution. Back in May, I had the opportunity to lead a walking tour exploring some of the historic churches of Brooklyn Heights. The tour was part of Jane's Walk, an international festival celebrating the life and legacy of urbanist Jane Jacobs. Jacobs believes cities work best when they're built for people, not cars. Places where you can walk to the corner store, meet your neighbors on the sidewalk, and experience a community at street level. To celebrate those ideas, New York City hosts more than 300 free walks each year. The best part is that most are led not by professional guides, but by people who simply want to share something they love about New York City. Whether you're interested in history, architecture, food, transportation, parks, or local neighborhoods, there's likely a walk for you. Today, I'd like to take you along the walk that I led, a journey through some of the churches that helped earn Brooklyn its nickname, the Borough of Churches. So if you're ready to get walking, let's go. Our first stop is one of the crown jewels of Brooklyn Heights, St. Anne's and the Holy Trinity Church. And right away, you're going to notice something unusual, that the church has two names. That's because St. Anne's Church and Holy Trinity Church merged in the 1960s. Originally, this building was simply known as Holy Trinity Church. The church was commissioned by Edgar John Bartow, a Brooklyn paper manufacturer who wanted to build a church that could rival the great churches in Manhattan, particularly Trinity Church on Wall Street. To make that vision a reality, he hired Menard Lefevre, one of the most important architects of the Gothic Revival movement in America. Construction began in 1846, and when it was completed, many considered it Lefevre's masterpiece. The tall spire that once crowned the church wasn't added until 1866. If you're looking up and wondering where that spire is today, the answer lies beneath your feet. In 1916, construction began on the subway tunnel running under Montague Street. Engineers feared the vibrations and excavation might damage the spire, so it was dismantled. Unfortunately, it wasn't preserved in a way that would allow it to be rebuilt later. Now, as impressive as the exterior is, the real treasure of this church is hidden inside. St. Anne's and the Holy Trinity contains more than 7,000 square feet of stained glass designed by William J. Bolton and his studio. These windows are considered the first major stained glass commission completed in the United States and represent a uniquely American approach to the art form. Traditional English stained glass is created by assembling pieces of colored glass like a giant mosaic, or think of it like a big giant puzzle. Bolton took a different approach. He painted detailed scenes directly onto sheets of glass, fired them in a kiln, and then protected the artwork by sandwiching it between additional layers of glass. The result was something revolutionary for its time. Bolton could create subtle facial expressions, shadows, folds in clothing, and intricate details that were nearly impossible to achieve with traditional stained glass techniques. The windows were so significant that several examples eventually found their way into the collection of the Metropolitan Museum of Art. So if you're ever visiting the Met, keep an eye out. You may spot a piece of Brooklyn history hanging on the walls. Now, I mentioned that this church wasn't always called St. Anne and the Holy Trinity. Our next stop is St. Anne's Church itself. But before we go, here's a little teaser. The St. Anne's we're about to visit isn't actually the church's original home. Welcome to St. Anne's Church, one of several Episcopal churches we'll visit on this tour. The Episcopal Church arrived in Brooklyn with the English, and the congregation that would eventually become St. Anne's was founded in 1787. Their first services were held near Fulton Ferry, and as the congregation grew, they found themselves needing more space. At one point, they even worshipped in a barn owned by one of Brooklyn's founding families, the Middaws. The structure you're looking at today was completed in 1869 and designed by James Renwick Jr., one of the most celebrated architects of the 19th century. If that name sounds familiar, it's because Renwick also designed St. Patrick's Cathedral in Manhattan. Most people today hear the name St. Anne's and immediately think of St. Anne's School, and that's actually a pretty reasonable connection to make. The school began in the basement of this church during the 1960s. It remained here for several years before expanding into other buildings throughout the neighborhood. If you'd like to learn more about St. Anne's School, check out the link in the description. Now, around that same time, St. Anne's Church merged with Holy Trinity Church, creating the congregation we visited at our last stop, St. Anne and the Holy Trinity. Now, whenever I'm giving tours in Brooklyn Heights, I like to play a little game. I'll point to an old church, factory, warehouse, or school building and ask people what they think it's used for today. The answer is usually the same, condos, and honestly, most of the time, they're right. So when I ask visitors what they think this church became, almost everyone guesses luxury apartments. But this building managed to avoid that fate, and today it's owned by Packer Collegiate Institute and is still used for educational purposes with classrooms inside. For our next stop, we'll continue exploring Brooklyn Heights Episcopal roots as we make our way over to Grace Church. Welcome to Grace Church, one of my favorite buildings in all of Brooklyn Heights. Part of that is because of its connection to one of the neighborhood's most important families, the Pierponts. specifically Henry Evelyn Pierpont, the son of Hezekiah Pierpont, who many consider the founding father of Brooklyn Heights. The church was designed by Richard Upjohn, one of the most influential architects of the 19th century. If that name sounds familiar, it's because Upjohn also designed Trinity Church on Wall Street. Later, he and Henry Pierpont would work together on another Brooklyn landmark that we'll talk about in a future video, Greenwood Cemetery. The story of Grace Church actually begins a few blocks away. The original Grace Church congregation was founded in 1842 and worshipped on Sydney Place. Like many churches in Brooklyn Heights at the time, it maintained close ties to a congregation in Manhattan. Parishioners could attend services in Brooklyn or simply take the ferry across the East River to Grace Church in Manhattan. But as New York City grew, that arrangement became less practical. Grace Church in Manhattan moved further uptown, making the trip from Brooklyn more difficult, and the congregation here continued to grow. Before long, the church on Sydney Place could no longer accommodate everyone, and that's where Henry Pierpont steps in. Pierpont donated the land, hired Richard Upjohn, and in 1848, this magnificent Gothic Revival church was completed. More than 175 years later, it remains one of the architectural highlights of the neighborhood, and while the exterior is impressive, the interior holds a surprise of its own. Grace Church contains stained glass windows created by Louis Comfort Tiffany. Yeah, that Tiffany. Now that we've explored the Episcopal churches, it's time to visit something different. For our next stop, we're heading to Our Lady of Lebanon, home of Brooklyn Heights Maronite Catholic community. Welcome to Our Lady of Lebanon Maronite Cathedral. If this church looks a little familiar, that's because it was also designed by Richard Upjohn, the same architect who just designed Grace Church, but despite sharing the same architect, the two buildings have very different personalities. What you see today isn't exactly what Upjohn intended. If you look at historic photographs of the church from the 1840s, you'll notice something's missing. A tall steeple once rose above the building. Much like St. Anne and the Holy Trinity, that steeple was eventually removed. The most common explanation is that concerns over nearby subway construction led to the church's officials taking it down rather than risk structural damage. If anyone watching knows the full story, I'd love to hear it in the comments. Originally, this building was known as the Church of the Pilgrims. During the late 19th and early 20th centuries, Brooklyn Heights was changing. Many longtime residents moved elsewhere, new neighborhoods emerged, and church memberships began to decline. By the 1930s, both the Church of the Pilgrims and nearby Plymouth Church were facing shrinking congregations. In 1934, the two churches merged, creating what became known as Plymouth Church of the Pilgrims. But here's one of my favorite details. The Church of the Pilgrims didn't leave everything behind when it moved. The building contained beautiful stained glass windows created by Tiffany, and rather than abandoning them, the congregation brought them along to their new home. Today, if you visit Plymouth Church, you can still see those Tiffany windows and trace their origins back to this very building. Not long after the merger, the church entered a new chapter in its history. In 1943, it was purchased by Brooklyn's growing Lebanese Maronite community and eventually became Our Lady of Lebanon. During the renovations, the church received one of the most unusual architectural additions in Brooklyn Heights. The doors on the church, those actually come from the SS Normandy, one of the most luxurious ocean liners ever built. I'll add a link to a video detailing that part of the church's history in the description. Now let's continue on to the church that absorbed this congregation nearly a century ago, Plymouth Church of the Pilgrims. One of the things I tell people at the beginning of my tours is that we're going to visit both the famous landmarks and some of Brooklyn Heights' hidden gems. Well, Plymouth Church definitely falls into the first category. Plymouth Church was founded in 1847, and shortly afterward the congregation extended a call to one of the most famous preachers in America, Henry Ward Beecher. Beecher came from a remarkable family. His sister was Harriet Beecher Stowe, author of Uncle Tom's Cabin, one of the most influential anti-slavery novels ever written. But in many ways, Henry became just as famous as his sister. People traveled from all over to hear him preach. In fact, his popularity became so great that ferry companies added a special Sunday service from Manhattan to Brooklyn. These ferries became known as Beecher boats because so many passengers were making the trip specifically to hear him speak. Beecher would even encourage members of his congregation to skip certain services so visitors from Manhattan would have a chance to get inside. It didn't always work. The church was often packed with crowds filling every available seat. But Beecher wasn't famous simply because he was a gifted speaker. He was also one of the country's most outspoken abolitionists. One of the most powerful things he did was hold mock slave auctions inside the church. Enslaved men and women who had escaped north would be brought before the congregation, and Beecher would ask parishioners to contribute money to purchase their freedom. Collections would be taken, funds would be raised, and lives would be changed. If you'd like to learn more about that side of Plymouth Church, I've actually made an entire video about it, and I'll add the link in the description. Plymouth Church also became a center for activism and social reform long after the Civil War. Over the years, it welcomed some of the most influential figures in American history. Abraham Lincoln visited here before becoming president, and a century later, Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. delivered an early version of his sermon, The American Dream, ideas that would later find their way into this famous I Have a Dream speech. Today, Plymouth Church remains an active congregation and one of the most important historical sites in Brooklyn Heights. Whether you're interested in architecture, religion, abolition, civil rights, or simply Brooklyn history, it's hard to find a building that has played a larger role in the story of this neighborhood. Now for our final stop, what looks like an ordinary Brooklyn Heights brownstone has one of the neighborhood's most fascinating secrets. Welcome to the Danish Seamen Church. Throughout the 19th and early 20th centuries, Brooklyn was one of the busiest port cities in the world. The waterfront, just a few blocks away from where we're standing, was crowded with ships arriving from across the Atlantic, bringing not only cargo, but people from all over the world. Among them were thousands of Scandinavian sailors and dock workers, Danes, Norwegians, Swedes, and Finns, many of whom lived and worked along Brooklyn's waterfront. The Danish Seamen's Church was founded in 1878 to serve that growing community. While the congregation is older than the building itself, it moved into this former brownstone in 1957 and has remained here ever since. Like many immigrant churches, its role extended far beyond Sunday services. For sailors arriving in a foreign city, the church provided a sense of home, a place where they could speak their native language, connect with their culture, and find support while far from family and friends. Today, the church continues that tradition as both a place of worship and a community center. One of its most popular events is the annual Christmas market, which draws visitors from all across the New York area and is well worth a visit if you're in the neighborhood. What makes this church especially unique is that its services are still conducted in Danish. In fact, it's believed to be the only church in North or South America that regularly holds worship services in the Danish language. While Brooklyn's waterfront has changed dramatically since the days of sailing ships and bustling docks, the Danish Seamen's Church remains a reminder of the immigrant communities that helped shape this neighborhood and the city around it. And with that, we've come to the end of our Borough of Churches walk. From grand Gothic Revival landmarks and abolitionist meeting places to immigrant congregations and hidden neighborhood treasures, these churches tell the story of the people who built Brooklyn Heights and helped earn Brooklyn its nickname, the Borough of Churches. I hope you enjoyed spending some time exploring this remarkable neighborhood with me. If you did, I'd really appreciate it if you'd give this video a like and subscribe to help the channel. It helps more people discover these stories and allows me to keep sharing the history of Brooklyn Heights and the city we all love. And if there's a church, a neighborhood, building, or a piece of New York history you'd like me to cover in a future video, let me know in the comments below. Until next time, thanks for walking with me.